One of the wonderful things about our military service is that we get to know people across the services, and it is kind of a little bit of a club, and one of the people who's one of my favorite people, we don't always agree, but Mark has been an intellectual powerhouse from the time he was in uniform. He's persisted through that in his retired life. And I know that mark that name down, Mark's name down, because you're going to be hearing more and more great things about what he's doing. Again, I'm not going to go through the bios. You can click on them and get them. Let's get right to Mark's presentation, because he has a very unique view of one of the key challenges that we're all going to be we're facing now.
Yes, sir.
I think one of the points he has. Thanks a lot.
Yes, sir. Yeah, thank you for the invitation, General Dunlap. And I want to thank you and Lens, which is always a highlight of my yearly battle rhythm, for taking a bit of a risk on the topic of climate change as a national security threat facing both the nation and the world. I've often said, or to paraphrase someone who I admire deeply, the future is already here, but it's not evenly distributed. So we come to Lens conferences to get a glimpse of where the future is heading, not just where national security law is right now, but where I believe national security law and some of the non-traditional threats facing the nation and the world are going. I feel in some respects, conceptualizing climate change as a national security issue is sort of a Professor Mike Schmidt topic from 20 years ago, where I wish I was paying attention to this cyber thing when I was getting my free AOL online discs in the mail. But I do think, particularly for the young people in the audience who are looking at challenges facing America and the world, looking at the security implications of climate change is a ripe area for scholarship with real-world implications. And there are more questions than answers right now, for so many of the questions are unresolved. Let me say up front that the military in some corners has been thinking about climate change as a security issue, mostly the United States Navy, though there's other departments in the DoD. But there's an emerging field of climate security that's been coming up forward in the last couple years that's getting more attention. And so it's a new scholarly area. So anytime you bring in environmental law and climate change, which I view as an offshoot of environmental law, dealing with national security law, I think there's a lot of opportunities to learn and exchange ideas, because traditionally these two areas of law have really been siloed from each other. And when they did engage, it was very much an adversarial way. Just look at the major environmental statutes in the United States. There are exemptions for the military or national security when it's in the paramount interest of the United States to do so. But climate change and national security requires a whole new reconceptualization of how we deal with environmental law and national security law, because what was once, I believe, adversarial may well be aligned in terms of where the world needs to go. So in my brief remarks, I'll talk about the national security implications of climate change. But please know that climate change is destabilizing many other areas of law throughout the first-year legal curriculum. Property law, land use law. Coastal communities must wrestle with sea level rise and manage retreat from vulnerable areas. How does the takings clause and climate adaptation measures, how will they be put into place for increase in natural disasters or storm surge? This is Mexico Beach following Hurricane Michael. This is an example of a climate resilient investment on Mexico Beach on the panhandle of Florida. We are thinking about, in property law, how should we think about buyouts or eminent domain proceedings, and what are the legal hurdles to think about managed retreat? Tort law. This is the Camp Fire disaster in California, the worst wildfire in American history. We are beginning to think now in Paradise, California, in tort law. How should emergency services be provided in areas that are uniquely vulnerable to climate change or natural disaster? This is forcing us to reconceptualize, I believe, the government's fundamental relationship with its citizens. Is there an affirmative duty to rescue you? Can you waive that duty? If you build in an area that is vulnerable to climate change and the government doesn't come rescue you, is there some sort of cause of action? this is being wrestled with in Paradise, California, and other vulnerable communities to climate change. It's already happening a little bit in Canada. It's increasingly going to happen in the United States. Contract law. This is Ellicott City, Maryland. They had a 1,000-year flood within 2 years. Notions of acts of God, unforeseeability, the contractual relationship you have with your insurance. What if those acts of God and unforeseeability become sort of normal weather? This is contract law is being stressed and destabilized in fundamental ways, which is all to say that national security law and climate change is the subject of the talk today, but there could be a symposium next week on property law, contract law, corporate law as investments flow out of fossil fuel industries. We saw that most recently with BlackRock, and also constitutional law. So in my scholarship, I've argued that we are entering a new climate security century that I believe will be defined by climate change's destabilizing impacts on the environment and the world. It is, in the words of Professor Richard Lazarus, who I was my environmental law instructor at Georgetown some years ago, it is a super wicked problem. It is a collective action problem on steroids. This has enormous legal implications and ethical implications for inequality, and for nations that are struggling with the impacts of climate change are often in the worst position to deal with their effects. So what is our role as a world, as a society, to wrestle with these ideas? So at this point, and this is, by the way, this is Tyndall Air Force Base in the aftermath of Hurricane Michael, I want to highlight to you sort of 10 questions that I think about as a scholar and someone who's really trying to move the ball forward on this issue of climate security and climate security scholarship. And I hope that, this brief talk, you will come away thinking that there's a there, and you too want to be more interested in the science, interested in the scholarship, and interested, frankly, in solutions to help deal with the security implications of climate change. So the first question is fundamental, which is sort of how do we frame climate change as a national security issue? It's a massive topic. I think fundamentally climate change is unlike sort of state-on-state action or other sort of traditional security threats in that climate change accelerates and exacerbates existing weather patterns, sea level rise, extreme weather, natural disaster. It sort of is a growth hormone for environmental effects and stressors. It may not be the source of the Camp Fire or the Australian wildfire, but it sets the underlying environmental conditions to make them worse and exacerbate them. It may not be the cause of sea level rise, but it will accelerate sea level rise, particularly as we wrestle with melting ice sheets in the Arctic. So my three-part framework for how do we frame climate change as a security issue is first adaptation. How do we adapt our physical environment for a future impacted by climate change? Again, this is Tyndall Air Force Base after Hurricane Michael. The second, of course, is climate mitigation. Where does this come in as a national security impact? And at several levels. One is through this notion of operational energy, which sort of deals with having more energy resilience, more energy security, and remove from the fossil fuel supply chain. But it's also mitigation. If the United States military was treated as its own independent nation, it would be about the 50th largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, according to Brown University's Cost of War project. I don't take a position on how that should be put into nationally determined contributions in the language of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. I just know that the atmosphere doesn't care where the emissions are coming from, whether it be agriculture, transportation, coal-fired power plants, or the U.S. Military. This has been the focus mitigation for much of the worldwide community through framework conventions, and even the Clean Air Act, but just recognize that the U.S. military is at least an emitter of large emissions. Climate change response, this is Hurricane Katrina. As a general matter, we need to move away from responsive actions and more to proactive actions. And that's why we're starting to wrestle with as a security component, what steps can we take ex ante to not be in a situation where we're responding to natural disasters and calling on the military to help communities out, but we need to be proactive in seeking solutions through land use, through the legal authorities to make sure that the steps are in place. So this is domestic response and, of course, international response. One of the tragedies of climate change, I believe, is that some of the poorest nations of the world that are low-lying and will be suffering the effects of climate change are in the worst position to actually deal with their effects. This is Bangladesh, heavily populated area. If you see a 1 meter sea level rise, which some of the climate change science suggests we will be that in this century, you will see 15 million people affected by sea level rise in Bangladesh. It is a very poor nation. Who is going to respond to this? Who is going to take in the climate refugees or migrants, or fill in the blank on how you want to label the people that are leaving their homelands? But certainly we need to start thinking about solutions. So that is it. How do we frame climate change as a security issue? I propose a way to think about it is adaptation. How do we adapt? Mitigation. How do we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions? There should be this conversation, I believe, about the role of the national security in their placement of greenhouse gas emissions and response, both domestically and internationally. So related to mitigation, I always think of what lessons, if any, let's look at what we've done in the past to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have had enormously successful treaty in the 1980s, the Montreal Protocol, which I remember growing up in Rhode Island, seeing this big hole in the ozone layer getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And I was like, oh my God, this is horrible. I was just 10 years old, the world's going to end. We actually came together with the Montreal Protocol to reduce ozone depleting gases. It was an enormously successful international top-down treaty convention that actually put the world on glide path to reduce some of our ozone depleting substances. And of course, the ozone layer has been in a state of health, in a state of repair since that timeline. You'll notice a little bit of a preview of the future, because the European community and the United States, and to some extent Russia, were large emitters of ozone depleting substances. China was very much a developing nation, in the words of climate change and international protocols, and they were not really included in the major Montreal protocols, at least initially, and they kept on emitting ozone depleting substances. Of course, China is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in 2020, about twice the annual rate of greenhouse gas emissions than the United States. So again, climate change is a super wicked problem. The third question I think about is, are the legal authorities in place to meet climate change's threats? Are we resourcing the military properly if indeed the science is correct, and if indeed we're seeing an uptick in natural disasters? Who will be stressed? Who will be tested to face these natural disasters? It is my belief that two elements of the military, one is the United States Coast Guard, will be increasingly called upon for their authorities and duties and expertise and training to respond, at least domestically, as well as the California National Guard. We have the U.S. Coast Guard here to the left after Hurricane Harvey, and we have the California National Guard, who of course have Title 32 and Title 10 authorities in the face of Camp Fire. So I believe that we need to get the legal authorities correct, we need to get the resources correct, the expertise correct, if we are starting to look forward prescriptively about some of the natural disasters and how we respond to those natural disasters at home. Fourth, also domestically, a hard question. When do we abandon? When do we retreat? When do we accommodate property? These are really, really hard decisions that are that I think is a security issue fundamentally. When do we engage with managed retreat? There's two issues as a legal matter I think that are important to recognize. One is the National Flood Insurance Program incentivizes building in areas that are vulnerable to climate change and flood through a federally subsidized flood insurance program. And that encourages, I think, a moral hazard in some respects related to incentivizing building in areas maybe you should not be building in. We have here, this is on the, I think in Louisiana, we have accommodation. We also have retreat with the airplane, looking as maybe I should leave at some point. And who should be making that decision about managed retreat, about abandonment, about accommodation? People who are the most vulnerable, even in the United States, the disabled, the elderly, children, poorer communities, Native American communities, are oftentimes who are at the leading edge, who are the most vulnerable to climate change. So there's a super wicked inequality problem that I think exists that I believe is also a security issue. Taking a step back, how is climate change impacting the Arctic, right? It's not just domestically, it is also internationally. Full disclosure, I've been looking at the Arctic for 10 years or so, the science on the Arctic has underestimated the rate of sea level rise, decrease, since we have started studying the Arctic. I do not know today in 2020 if we fully understand the pace of climate change in the Arctic. My jaw dropped in 2018 when the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report came out saying that the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the world. Initially, it was 1.5, then it was 2. Now it's 2.3 times faster than the rest of the world. So what? Well, 2 reasons for the so what. One is this is opening up potentially continental shelves, resources on the seabed for oil and gas extraction. Russia is very interested in this, as is China. And second, it's also opening up sea routes. The Northwest Passage through Canada, who of course is an ally, but the Northern Sea Route via the coast of Russia, which has about half of the continental shelf in the Arctic Ocean. And so that is opening up sea ice, new trade routes throughout the Arctic. So the 5th question I ask is, how is climate change truly impacting the Arctic? The answer is we have a better idea than we once did, but if we're being honest, I do not think we fully understand the level of sea ice melting in the Arctic in the way that we should. Side note, most of sea ice melting is between Russia and the United States. If you look at the map in the left-hand corner. 6th question, what are Russia's ambitions and what are China's ambitions in the Arctic? We need to be engaged on that. This is a look of the map of the Arctic. From the top down, you have Denmark via Greenland, Russia, the United States, Norway, and Canada as being sort of the core Arctic nations, Arctic coastal states. Of course, there's no Arctic Treaty. The Arctic Council is the work of the Arctic states to collaborate and work together. But of course, the Arctic Council cannot address matters of military security. So at one point, does issues of national security become on the fore, and that starts to stress the security situation in the Arctic? So the 6th question I ask is, what are Russia's ambitions, and related, what are China's ambitions in the Arctic? Just as a matter of economics, you don't have to accept everything I'm saying, but you should just know that the trip from China to Paris is about a week shorter and 2,000 kilometers shorter than going through the Suez Canal. And a similar time frame is through the Northwest Passage as well. So that saves time, it saves money. If we're looking at a ice-free Arctic summer, which someone estimate as early as 2035, even as 2030, this will be a new potential trade route in our lifetime, a fundamental shift of the operational environment, especially for the young people who are looking at this. So we need to be cognizant, aware of what are China's ambitions, what are Russia's ambitions in the Arctic. China has declared itself a near-Arctic nation. China is nowhere near the Arctic. It is nowhere near the Arctic. They have a full Arctic strategy. They are heavily invested in the Arctic. There are about 5,000 Chinese industry workers working in Greenland right now for mineral extraction. Greenland is a population of about 60,000 people. Greenland is melting with enormous implications for methane gas release, as well as stressing the relationship that Greenland has with Denmark. That's a whole side issue I'd love to talk to you offline. Okay, it's not all doom and gloom, but the problems are serious. Closer to home, you probably have seen this very much in the news. This is a question I think would not have been addressed at the Lens conference a couple years ago. Maybe I'm too soon on this question, General Dunlap, but it is at least being spoken by some scholars and some parts of at least the legal academy and some advocates. Is climate change a national emergency? This is an enormously controversial issue within U.S. domestic law, but there's been some discussion about what authorities could the president take to address climate change as a security issue. This was brought to the fore, of course, after President Trump's declaration of a national emergency at the border in Mexico. It's my belief that the president can take certain actions. In fact, there's actually pending congressional legislation by a major presidential candidate on this issue right now, the declaration of a climate change emergency, ranging from just a simple climate change emergency declaration to actually taking adaptation measures at vulnerable communities, to a more far-off-reaching view would take limiting fossil fuel extraction on U.S. government lands, using the existing national security infrastructure via the National Emergencies Act. Is climate change a national emergency? Certainly has a certain powerful linguistic value, but there are potential legal authorities that could flow from this if a president was to declare climate change a national emergency. This president, not anytime soon, but just know that presidents do change every 4 years. Potentially. Another sort of controversial topic that is nowhere near stated to be resolved, but at least is being discussed in the scholarly community. This is the United Nations discussion, Security Council discussion of climate change as a threat to international peace and security. The United Nations Security Council on International Law has gradually expanded the definition of non-traditional threats, particularly after the Cold War, to include not just state-on-state action, but to include health crises, terrorism, Ebola, HIV. I believe the UN Security Council will take some action on the coronavirus at some point in the future if we are still down on this pathway, whether it be funding or a United Nations declaration of a threat to international peace and security. Could climate change be considered a threat to international peace and security, activating some of their powers under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter? You may dismiss this, and I think that we should be very, very careful about any sort of UN Security Council involvement in climate change as a normative matter. But when you look at the threats facing certain nations of climate change and climate change's impacts, you start to see that the threat is much closer to us than we may imagine. The eighth question, I will just put this up, and related to potential UN Security Council action is this. I came across this. I read a lot of science articles, which is fascinating. And most of the headlines and the titles are kind of boring. I understand about half of them. But I understood this one. This is a peer-reviewed science article that came out about a year and a half ago from 10 of the leading climate scientists. And I don't know if they understood the legal implications when they wrote this article in Science Advance magazine or Science Advance publication, but everyone in this room probably does know. If indeed atoll islands would be uninhabitable by the mid part of the century, we're talking about nation extinction. There are 4 atoll nations: Kiribati, Tuvalu, Republic of Marshall Islands, and the Maldives Islands, who are all atoll nations, as is the Spratly Islands. As a side note, which I'm not as concerned about the Spratly Islands because they're going to be a huge climate change loser. But dealing with climate refugees, small island developing states, what are the tools that we have in place today to deal with nation extinction? Who's responsible for that? Who will take these atoll nations in, if indeed the science is correct and we can accept that? The Marshall Islands has a relationship with the United States, as many of you know. And so many people in the Marshall Islands are moving to Arkansas as we speak. About 8 to 10% of the population have left the Republic of the Marshall Islands, have moved to a small town in rural Arkansas. I can only imagine the sociological discussion. That's a great probably PhD dissertation about moving from Marshall Islands to Arkansas. But fundamental questions of who will help them out. If the UN Security Council, for example, is the organization that has the authority and responsibility to determine threats to international security, threats to international peace and security, if your nation is facing extinction, is that not a threat? If you're living in that nation, I would submit that it would be. This is a picture of Kiribati after a fairly routine rainstorm. Kiribati is a very poor island in the South Pacific, and you see that the GDP per capita of many of these nations are very, very small. So who will take them in? Who can help them adapt? Who can take in climate refugees? Okay, so this is a bit of a doom and gloom, but these questions are on my mind. The last question, the 10th question, I should say the 9th question is, what are the ethical and moral responsibilities for wealthy countries to assist poorer countries? This has been the focus of a lot of climate change negotiations on the international stage, and frankly, put climate change negotiations very much on the sideline for about 10 years based upon that very question. So the final question is really for everyone here in this audience, which hopefully I've at least generated some interest. And this is, hey, maybe we should, this Nevitt guy, maybe he's onto something, maybe not. You'll definitely want to verify everything I'm saying as good lawyers. But what can you do to increase your awareness and knowledge? If I was king for a day, I would have assigned this homework assignment. The first is reading the summary for policymakers for the National Climate Assessment, which represents the U.S. government interagency look at climate science. The summary for policymakers is about 10 pages. It'll take about a half an hour to read, and you'll know more about the latest climate science from a peer-reviewed publication from the U.S. government than you know more than 90% of Americans. There's also a national security, international security chapter as part of that if you get really interested. The second thing I would recommend reading is the IPCC report, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. They also have a nice executive summary for policymakers. So for folks like myself who don't have a PhD in climate science, they break it down to real-world impacts. And so I would encourage everyone to engage with the scientific literature, and I would start here with the National Climate Assessment and the IPCC report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, actually not Fahrenheit, but Celsius. So those are my thoughts. Those are the 10 questions on my mind. I want to know what's on your mind.
Mark, thank you very much. Really, really fascinating. And this is a national security issue. It is true in the military that, and we have both military lawyers and civilian lawyers working in environmental, but Mark's taken it the next level, the strategic level. And before Gabriella asked her question, I have a question that stimulates. I have two students in my use of force class, write on the notion of under international law. Mike, pay attention, listen, because I might ask you for something on this. The Amazon, the lung of the world. If you have a country that, for its national policy reason, is burning down the lung, do you foresee a possibility in the future that either A, the Security Council might act on that in terms of going in and by force halting that destruction, or B, some kind of idea of self-defense, participatory self-defense? Could you imagine international law maturing in that way, or is that just not in the cards? And do you normatively think that's a good idea?
Normatively, I don't think it's a good idea right now, General Dunlap. I do think there's a role for scholars in raising these issues and asking these questions. In the Bolsonaro example, where you're seeing environmental destruction, I completely agree with you that it has a special role in mitigating greenhouse gas emissions, the Amazon, even though Brazil obviously has autonomy over that. There is some interesting work being done by Craig Martin on that exact point. Atmospheric intervention. It's an article forthcoming in the Columbia Environmental Law Journal in a month or two on that question right now. Is there a role for the Security Council resolution to potentially penalize Brazil for not adapting policies that are impacting the rest of the world? There also could be under the National Emergencies Act, which is more provocative, using existing authorities under export, the IEEPA, to potentially use that power to penalize Brazil with relationships independent of congressional legislation. Of course, trade has been more of a national security issue. I'm not an expert on that issue myself, but of course, under this president, we've seen a more capacious view of national security. So there's sort of an element of unintended consequences of having such a capacious view, which could maybe be used by future presidents.
Mike, can you imagine a use of force authorization on that topic?
Yeah, I certainly think under Chapter 7 of the Security Council, Article 39, there's no question that that could be a threat to the peace. I'll just repeat very quickly. I think under Chapter 7 of the Charter, that could be a threat to the peace. Article 39, that would entitle the United Nations to mandate even military action, although I can't really imagine that. It certainly is possible. Under self-defense, that's interesting because I see the environment posing an opportunity to make the armed attack argument, but normally in the context of a neighbor that's cutting off, for example, water supply that poses an existential threat and so forth. Something that would represent a global threat, I'm not so sure, because usually armed attack under Article 51 is State A is threatening State B, and that's not the case here. So I think the Chapter 7 option would be viable.
Mm-hmm.
Gabrielle, what was your question? No.
Hi, Professor. My name's Gabriella. I'm a 3L at Brooklyn Law School. We're talking a lot about situations where there's military involvement, federal projects, disaster relief, and even in the situation of a national emergency, you'd have emergency powers invoked that would have an external, outside of the United States effect. But recent climate change litigation, most especially like the Juliana case, is alleging constitutional rights. So for instance, the federal government is depriving us, American citizens, of life, liberty, and property. Do you think it would be acceptable to frame a national security concept as one where the individuals' security, the individuals of the nation have their security at risk, as opposed to one where there's a more clear international nexus with the nation as a whole and climate change?
Potentially. If you read the Juliana lawsuit, that was the Children's Trust case out of Oregon, where they sued the United States government. It was Juliana who was the named litigant, but it's also children who are now kind of much older, for the United States allowing fossil fuel drilling on government lands, claiming essentially this novel constitutional substantive due process right, that the U.S. government is denying them the right to liberty and right to a healthy, clean environment, sort of an innovative climate change claim. They also argue public trust, which I won't get into that, related to sea level rise. If you read the Juliana lawsuit closely, they actually argue, in part, national security destabilization as part of the litigation, which I thought is fascinating. These are environmental lawyers who are speaking of the same language of territorial integrity, sovereignty, national security destabilization as part of their litigation. That may have potentially more legs. Full disclosure, I've spoke with some of the litigants on this a little bit, but it could have potentially more legs. What else can I say about that? It lost at the Ninth Circuit recently, but it's under appeal en banc to the Ninth Circuit. So it has certainly showcased some of the. So the government has gone on the record, if nothing else, by showcasing their role in not protecting its citizens.
Zach? I was actually going to call on you, Zach. So it's like a little bit trashy. Law school.
Thank you, Zach Austin from Yale Law School. I want to say that General Dunlap mischaracterized our institutions. Not only are our questions too long, we also couch them in esoteric hypotheticals. Keep that in mind. I want to ask if there's a danger in your mind about over-regulating environmental protections contributing to a national security risk. And the example I'll give is this. Let's say tomorrow we wake up and the Chinese declare the entire exclusive economic zone in the South China Sea to be a fishery protection zone under their UNCLOS authorization. And some of their new restrictions involve no weapons fire, no sensor radiation, and you can't navigate any vessel above 100 tons unless you're part of the maritime militia to protect the fish. What do we do in that sort of situation?
See, case made. Case closed.
Mm-hmm.
I gave you a couple extra seconds to think about that, Mark. And you got 2.5 minutes to answer it.
I think it's just quite the opposite. For climate change, the biggest worry is that we're under-regulating an externality, right? Carbon emissions are paid throughout the cost of society. We don't have a climate change law. We have the Clean Air Act, but we don't have an adaptation law governing federal lands or So the worry for me is not overregulation, is actually underregulation and known externality. You can get very conservative PhD economists and agree, absolutely, we should tax carbon or have a cap and trade or some system to price it effectively. Very conservative because that's not being internalized effectively, and it's being paid disproportionately throughout different elements of society. So on the Chinese example, of course, that's a longer discussion, but I sort of disagree with the underlying premise of we need to properly price. I've argued we're already paying a carbon tax. It's just hidden, it's unfair, and it's just disproportionately shared by different people. So my big worry is actually under-regulating this externality.
Unfortunately, we really are out of time. But Mark, I want to thank you. I thought I was kind of smart in this area, but this is another example of, wow, I didn't know that kind of
Thank you, sir.
reflection. Thanks a lot.